Yeah, hi, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks for hosting this panel and the conference. It's a pleasure to be here. And yeah, please join me on stage. Danna, Ingleton, Rory crew, Patrick Vinck, our esteemed panelists today. We're tackling the topic of digital transformation in the humanitarian sector. We're hacking the future, so let's see how far we get today. I actually really liked, I was recently at a conference in Canada, and there was one colleague on the panel who was coining the phrase, less memos, more demos. So let's let that be the spirit of our conversation today. Just a few words on you, Danna Ingleton, Executive Director of HURIDOCS. Close, yeah. Okay, kind of. And then we have Rory, crew from the data and digitalization expert at the CaLP network. And we have Patrick Vinck, who's co-founder of KoBo tools and research director of the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. So yeah, we're talking about digital transformation. I personally, my link to the humanitarian aid field is basically that I'm here, to be honest. So if there's any kind of mishaps or something, please correct me. I'm just learning. But my interest here really is the topic of data exchange, interoperability, and how we can use technology in order to boost the efficiency of providing humanitarian aid. So I'm very happy to learn from you guys today. And obviously, we're all aware of the buzzwords going around in technology, and we'll try to come to grips with how we can make advantage of it, take advantage of these in the specific field. So I want to start out with a question to Patrick. And actually, like, the question will be directed to all of you, but just a general, maybe, insight into what do you feel, how do you see the state of digital transformation in the sector, in the area? Maybe you have some examples you want to give. I mean, you certainly have the knowledge of working with KoBo tools for 20 years. Which is impressive, and looking forward to hear a little more about it. But yeah, maybe you can give us some insight into how you see the state of affairs.
Sure. No, thank you for the kind introduction and the challenging first question. Obviously, and I think this audience knows very well the value of technology, and I think one of the things we don't really need to do is make the case for technology. The reality is that technology is adopted because it provides clear advantage, right? So our ability now to know what's happening, to know people. Earlier in the panel, in the previous panel, we talked about perception surveys, about needs assessment. I mean, those things are done routinely. We have satellite imagery, we have on-the-ground data collection. Of course, KoBo Toolbox part of that. Talk a little bit more about that later. But so our ability to know what's happening, to understand people, capture that information, the tools that we have at hand to operate from, well, cash was mentioned. Well, a lot of the cash is done through digital cash transfer, right? So we have kind of reached a clear value proposition for technology as a whole. So that's the positive part. But you know, we talked about pessimism or the negative. I'm the glass half empty type of guy at time. And I would say some of the challenges deal with technology as the solution. This morning, what I was thinking was, you know, if I was a little younger, we probably would have had a drinking game with what's the local, Tallinn? That's the local, you know, take one shot every time you hear the word efficiency. And I think technology is a little bit of a solutionism and saying, oh, we're going to get more efficient because of technology. And in part, it's true. We see it with some of the gains. But it's also a challenge when efficiency is driving the adoption of technology. Because of what was mentioned, because of what it means for protection, for example, for transferring risk because of the use of technology. For engagement, well, the other game is the bingo game, so I don't know that AI has been mentioned many times, but all of us in the room can, in the next 20 minutes, create a pretty reasonable grant proposal on water and sanitation in northern Nigeria, or whatever it is, because of AI. But that's without engagement. That's without, clear relevance to the context. But we can do it, and so it has the feature, it has the appearance of efficiency. But in practice, I liked what I was saying earlier, it's really dangerous. It's really not achieving that. So I think part of where we are now is the need to move forward with the other dimension of technology, that is the people themselves, not widening the gap, but making sure that the tools we're using, the processes, and that's where open source comes into play, are easy to adopt. Moving forward with principles, policies on coordination, on how we do these things well. I don't know if that sets the stage.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, emphasizing people was actually also one of the closing remarks from the previous panel, that we're focusing on people. It's increasing theme in public sector digitization, that you're talking about people-centric government services. So in that sense, like emphasizing that certainly is critical, but also obviously it's the people that are gonna make use of the technology. So certainly, but maybe Rory, what's your perspective on this? Like, how do you see as digital transformation, like transforming the sector? Like,
thank you. I appreciate the taking shot every time efficiency was mentioned. Although I thought if I had to choose beforehand, it would be AI as well. And I think we're now 10 past 1, and I think this is the first mention of AI that we've had today, which is sort of astounding at a digital conference, but I also love it as well. But I also thanks to the ERC and the Ministry for bringing us all here together. I think in an increasingly remote world, coming together in these sort of smaller spaces, outside of the big conferences, is an invaluable way to come together and actually solve problems. As Patrick said, I think there's a sort of techno-solutionism approach that can pervade and bring some optimism to the sector, but technology is always the easy bit of the solution as well, particularly in the age of AI as well. But it's also particularly special for me to be here, to be able to speak to this in Estonia as well, a country that's been leading the way on digital delivery of public services and a people-centered delivery as well. So thank you for the opportunity today. Just so I work for a quick plug, I work for CaLP. We've got a long tagline, but we're the cash people. And it was great to see Eero's first slide had some of our data on it as well. Unfortunately, showed a rather sort of depressing view of the level of cash assistance globally, that we've seen that cash is perhaps one of the biggest successes of the humanitarian sector over the last 2 decades. Although cash has been used as a sort of response and relief for thousands of years, as long as money has existed as well. And he also stole a lot of my talking points around efficiency, speed, shorter supply chains, and obviously dignity as well, which I think is one of the sort of primary things which we should always come back to as well. I think in terms of the thematics that I sort of hear the most, and perhaps get me most excited, I mean, digital payments is absolutely up there as well. So, about at the peak, about 24% of humanitarian assistance was delivered as cash. And lots of organizations came together and thought that could be up to 50%. And instead, with this funding cuts, we've actually seen the volume of cash has decreased quicker than the volume of humanitarian funding, which to me is borderline criminal. In a sector which says that we're people-centered and that we listen to what people want, and people consistently say 2 things when you ask them about humanitarian programs: that they want more cash, and they want better and more information about the programs which they're involved and enrolled on as well. So the fact that those cash volumes and percentages are decreasing as well is it should be a slap in the face to us. And we've heard from the first panels this morning about some of the potential solutions around that as well. But in most cases, cash is delivered by the private sector. So I think we often speak around private sector engagement, and it's a theme we work on a lot at CaLP, because most organizations don't deliver cash themselves. So we're already really deeply enmeshed within the private sector, but we I think, keep them too much at an arm's length as well. I think we'll hear more, particularly about the human rights aspects of this as well later, that, okay, we need to be careful in our relationships around them, but we also need to help them and allow them to invest and build a profitable business and sustainable business as well, where appropriate as well. We're hearing a lot about group cash transfers at the moment, particularly in OPT, Sudan as well. Interoperability, which is why we're all, it sort of brought this panel together today, I think is potentially one of the driest topics out there. But when you really dig into it, the reasons it's sort of failed, or at least hasn't succeeded, really is the underpinnings of all the challenges that we're facing in the humanitarian sector at the moment. So if we solve those, then interoperability and its potential benefits will be unlocked as well. I think the other thing we are seeing quite a lot of promise, at least interest in, is around stablecoins as well. There are a lot of good ideas around there at the moment, but if you take an idea to a donor without a blockchain and with a blockchain, with a stablecoin approach, that stablecoin approach is going to get funded way quicker than the non-blockchain approach, rightly or wrongly as well. But it's definitely something that's being sort of tapped into. And I get it. I think the underlying decentralization aspects of the technology appeal to the sort of independent humanitarian mind as well, even though it doesn't, I think, fully align. If you'd asked me this question 3-4 years ago, we'd have been talking a lot about biometrics. And again, I think there's a human rights aspect there as well. And I think as a sector, particularly cash sectors, we've sort of moved away from using biometrics because of the risks and challenges faced by that as well. And then lastly, and I think we'll sort of touch on this a bit, I would sort of push back around the sort of transformation language, because for me, transformation means really a significant and material change. And if you took somebody who worked in the sector 20 years ago and brought them to listen to the panel this morning, would they recognize the sector? I think they would, and I think they'd probably say, oh wait, those challenges are essentially the same ones that we were working on 20 years ago as well. We've renamed things. We've renamed cash as multi-purpose cash. We've got the cluster system now. We've got this sort of coordination. But fundamentally, I don't think there's been an awful lot of change. There's certainly a lot more similarities than change. And perhaps that's not a bad thing as well. But I think transformation is too big a word to sort of throw around. I think it could be seen as a more iterative approach. And I think with digitalization, what we've done is really enhanced control over how funds are spent and used. And I'm not sure that was the right approach as well. I think we've spent a lot of time thinking about what donors want, because they're the ones giving us the money, and how we spend that money. I think we think as implementers, I spent a lot more time thinking around donor compliance than about what recipients wanted, or their views or perspectives as well. Because that was the metrics I was held to account. If I couldn't reclaim $1 million of donor funds, I'd lose my job. But, an unhappy recipient did not, impact my, future employability as well. So I think over this panel, I'd also like to explore then, how can we harness this to really keep bringing it back to that people-centered approach, which we opened with as well. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, very, very intriguing, very interesting. Danna, do you want to comment on that? Do you have, yep?
Yeah, sure, I can come in really quickly. So yeah, just again to introduce myself, I'm Danna Ingleton, and you did a very good job with a very difficult name, which is our organizational name, HURIDOCS, which actually stands for Human Rights Information and Documentation Systems. So I'm a little bit of an outlier here today, coming squarely from the human rights space and community. And my organization is, I like to describe it as like a curious beast, because we have some like librarian kind of nerds, we have human rights experts, and we have technologists. So we basically build open source documentation tools for human rights research and researchers. I should also say before I talk too much that I get really excited about these topics, and I tend to talk pretty quickly. So if I'm going too quickly, literally just wave your hands at me, because I do get a little overexcited. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you to the Estonian Refugee Council for having us. And I'm actually so thrilled to be here because I think we often talk about the silos of our work. We heard a lot of talk about Nexus earlier. But I think the commonalities between the humanitarian and the human rights sector are greater than their differences. And acts of being here and acts of taking down these silos are truly acts of care and solidarity in a world that needs care and solidarity more than ever. Both of my fellow panelists up here made really excellent points around digitization that I don't necessarily need to repeat. So I'll focus on a few things that maybe haven't come up yet. For us in the human rights sector, particularly now in the age of information, it's not about having access to data, it's making the information in that data accessible, right? It used to be, particularly in the human rights world, that it was hard to find evidence. Now it's not hard to find evidence, it's hard to make sense of the evidence. And a lot of the work going on now with my organization and my sector is about unlocking data so that it's actually useful. And I'll get into that a little bit more. Because better access to information and data means you can make better analytics, which means you can have better storytelling and memory building. And I think that's a huge part of what we're also doing is that, we are also witnessing pretty atrocious things happening, and data in the humanitarian sector is really helpful for operationalizing, but that data means so much more. Those are stories of the impact of things on people's lives, and I think that's a huge piece. Two other really quick points really support the move away from tech solutionism. I have been riding the wave of tech solutionism for quite a long time in my career, and I will be attending the failure session later to share some of the examples of where building tech has failed. And so I just really want to emphasize that digitalization is and can be different than tech solutionism, because it can be about democratization of tools and it can be about democratization of data. And particularly when we get to talking about open source, for me, this is a value-based proposition, which is important. The last thing that I will mention also is it was already raised a little bit about the digital divide, and this is something we've all been talking about for a really long time. And now with the proliferation of AI, we have what I like to just refer to as like a compounded digital divide, right? And we are seeing a huge difference between people who have and know how to use the tools and people who don't. And a huge part around digitization and technology should be about lessening that and bringing more people along, which includes deciding what we're going to build with tech based on the actual needs, not on the tech that exists. And I think that's going to be hopefully a part of the discussion. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, great. I'll just a reminder, so you feel free to ask your own questions on Slido as well. But I want to follow up on, Rory, what you called interoperability is probably the driest topic. It's actually, I don't agree. While I do agree that, if you're actually talking about the standards, and if you're actually talking about, making comprehensive standards and different information systems talking to each other, it can get pretty dry. But the concept of interoperability, so that's what we want to talk about, is something that, first of all, got me really interested in IT, to be honest. So we're in Estonia. Estonia is known as a progressive player in the domain of digital government. Continuously sets the agenda on that. Is highly regarded, and one of the key components of this is a data exchange platform called X-Road, which is an open source software. It has been around for 20 years, maybe just 5 years longer than KoBo tools. And it's a platform that allows private and public sector organizations to exchange data, to integrate their business processes. Something that I'm originally German, find really interesting that there's like this comprehensive layer standard for how to bring organizations that are so different in nature, in their jurisdiction, in their jobs, like to bring them actually together and allow to facilitate the exchange of data, which doesn't necessarily change how they do their business, but it changes the fact that they can actually come together to share data. So talking about interoperability, data exchange in this domain, I would like to hear your your understanding of the concept and maybe where you see the potential for this to actually create value.
Thank you. And I think this government-led approach is a fantastic example of why we've seen less success around interoperability in the humanitarian sector than in most other sectors as well. And because if you look at the sort of the solutions which most obviously spring to mind, it's around banking, for example. It'd be very annoying if your bank card would only work at your bank's ATM, or your charging cable only worked in like that brand of phone as well. So you'd go to a bar and you'd have to find somebody with a Samsung phone to use their charging cable. But in a lot of cases, who was it that pushed for this interoperability or these sort of common standards that allow these interoperability? It wasn't consumer or public need or desire, despite that being the clear benefit. It was governments and regulators saying, no, you absolutely have to do this. Now, of course, what's the biggest bank in Estonia? Swedbank.
Swedish bank.
So, of course, they would want a monopoly, I'm sure. They probably, when I'm started, maybe I'm maligning them unfairly, but probably they didn't want interoperability. Their approach been, well, if we're just the biggest bank here and we do everything, then we don't need interoperability because we will own all the systems as well. And I guess there could be an argument that that could be quite efficient as well. Actually, I mean, research suggests that monopolies can actually be quite efficient in some respects as well. But then I assume the sort of governments and regulators and supranational organizations sort of pushed back and said, okay, no, your things need to be interoperable as well. And within the humanitarian sector, there isn't that one body which is forcing these organizations to do this. And I think, as Reshma said earlier, described this as the sort of needing to break down these sort of binary approaches as well, which I think is really fundamental. That we're not a donor versus implementer, or donor implementer, or national international. I think as a sector, it's probably my biggest bugbear that we spend all our time creating silos to define things. So at some point in the past, before I joined the sector, we created the distinction between humanitarian and development. Now, you ask any recipient who receives support from any of these programs, are you on a humanitarian or a development program? They probably wouldn't know, and they certainly wouldn't care. But we created those silos, and now we've created the nexus to break down the silos, which we then created in the first place, which seems to me, it almost seems like jobs creation, if I was being overly cynical about it as well. But within interoperability in this space, I think we approached it in the wrong way. So it sort of first arose as a sort of donor-driven approach, particularly around sharing information to avoid duplication. And I can see the perspectives there. So, if you're running a cash intervention in, say northern, Kenya, and you've got one donor, might well be funding, several organizations within northern Kenya through a cash intervention, or maybe a cash and wash or something as well. It's sort of fairly logical that you'd want those implementers to either not be supporting the same people or be intentional about whether or not they supported the same people as well. So then the donors would come together, or the donors would say, okay, can you share data between each other on who you're supporting, and then to avoid duplication. And then perhaps the other donors would also come together and say a similar thing. Well, actually, why are you just deduplicating amongst one donor when we should be deduplicating against all recipients from all donors or receiving funds from all donors in northern Kenya as well? And all a very logical, I think, approach. And I think the donors have been increasingly frustrated, but also patient as to why there's been relatively few examples now where this data sharing has occurred. And I think one of the fundamental challenges which we need to reverse and unpick is that deduplication is more of a donor and an equity concern than a recipient and a people-centered concern. So in the first day, hours, weeks, days of a crisis, deduplication, I think, is not a concern that most recipients have. Because they just, whoever's receiving money, the communities say, people should just be receiving, cash or whatever support they're receiving as well. And it doesn't really matter who receives it, because they will also then, engage in community sharing as well. I think once it goes on for months, then I think these issues in the community come up more and become more of a people-centered approach. But interoperability became this tool that was attractive before we'd really defined the problem. And we had the same with blockchain as well. Blockchain, sort of came around, despite, being older than the iPhone, or about the same age, we still refer to it as a new technology. And then we're constantly still trying to figure out what areas of humanitarian space can the blockchain solve, rather than saying, what is the problem, and finding the solution as well. And interoperability, we've done the same. Because interoperability is the solution, it is the tool, but let's figure out the problem. And the problem should be one which is faced by recipients. And I think there are lots of things which interoperability could solve, referrals, repeated registrations as well. I mean, you go to somewhere like South Sudan, and you will have communities who are registered by 4 different organizations using an ODK-based tool, maybe a KoBo-based tool, for different interventions over the course of 4 registrations over 4 days as well. So I think there's a real people-centered, recipient-driven benefit to reducing or to having interoperability, because you can share that data. And once you've got that data, you can then perhaps refer it to other interventions. If you're signing somebody up for a shelter program and they have mental health concerns, for example, you can then refer them to a mental health program. Or if if they've got cash needs, you refer to them. So also the referrals is something that can be done in a people-centered way. So I think focusing, and I always say this, focus on the problem first. Define your problem, and then you can figure out what the solution is. And when you're thinking about the solution, make sure you consider who it benefits and who shoulders the risks of that solution. Because too often the benefits are borne by the agencies, or sometimes the donors themselves, and the risks are borne by the recipients. And that's something we absolutely have to get away from.
Okay, thank you. Patrick, so you're co-founded KoBo Tools, and maybe you can give some perspective on how you address, what was the problem that you were trying to solve, maybe, when you started out, and how has this evolved over time, and how do you today maybe address the issue of recipient versus donor, who's your user, and who do you develop your platform for?
Yeah. Having joked about efficiency, I'll use the word a few times.
Everybody take a shot, please.
When KoBo started, the problem was very concrete. We were in the field, and it was taking us anywhere between 6 months to a year to be able to translate data being collected in the field, transcribe it, translate it, analyze it, report on it. In other words, by the time you had data on which you could make decisions or inform actions, it was way too late. I was working in Iraq in 2003, and it took us a year to get feedback on political processes like debathification and removal of the army. I mean, a number of things following the invasion. By the time we had the data, it was too late. The situation had evolved in a completely negative phase. And so the primary driver was an efficiency driver. It was about, we need to code the data in the field so that it's directly usable. And that's how we started, you literally using the money we would normally spend on photocopies and data entry to develop the first prototypes, and we used Windows mobiles and things. There was no iPhone, there was no Android phones, then ODK came out, and we adopted some of the standards, and so it evolved that way really in response to a very concrete, specific needs, and kind of driven by efficiency on speed. But in the process, we realized that it was equipping us with far better way to control quality, to think about protection, to think about risk, to think about how to integrate multiple streams of data within one tool. And as the tool evolved, 20 years is when the ID started, but 10 years is kind of the modern version of KoBo. And by then, the question of interoperability and we're much more salient. For us, it was never a question. It was going to be an open source tool. We wanted to focus on accessibility. That was the key thing. But then we started to realize that it's easy to get funding when it comes to proposing a key feature and efficiency gains, right? So today I see so many initiatives on financial inclusion or whatever it is. Like, you can get funding for that. If you go to a donors and you say, we'd like to solve interoperability, nobody's going to give you money for that. And so part of the challenge now is how do you build back some of those critical infrastructure? And in part, it's driven by necessity. So we have integration. We have organizations working to facilitate. I mean, when I think of interoperability, is that flow of data, and while at the same time minimizing the risk. It's, again, not necessarily super appealing to many traditional source of funding for technology, but it's driven by necessity, and so we see organizations investing in that. But the fundamental issue is maybe less technical or technological. The fundamental issue is that who has data data is value, is money, right? You can go to your donor, this is my data set, this is the data I collected, this is a unique insight that I have, and then you go to the donor and you monetize, you value that. What we've seen is organizations, the reason it's called KoBo Toolbox, sorry, I'm train of thoughts, but the reason it's called KoBo is Toolbox is, one, KoBo means transferring naturally, and the idea was transferring information from one organization or from communities and exchange that information across actors. But the toolbox component was this idea of setting up a system, a service for organization. What we realize is many organizations don't want their data to, I know we're talking of the cloud, but to kind of physically sit with other data. And whereas KoBo was initially conceived as a way so that we could tell, even if you don't have access to the data, you could tell, hey, I want to know who has done food security assessment in Yemen in the last 3 years. You should be able to get that data. Well, we can't. Why? Because many organizations just want to have their own server, their own system. And so it has a component of technology, but also really a behavioral component and trust component. I don't know if that makes all sense. But.
Yeah, no, thanks for these answers. And Danna, maybe you're developing open source tools, so maybe you can give also some perspective on what's the problem that you're solving and how does technology come in.
Yeah, I would love to talk about the problem, and I also want to step back about it into this bigger question of interoperability. And one of the things is solving the need, but I think when we talk about interoperability, it's a pretty big topic. And actually, if you talk to different people, some people might have different ideas of what you mean when you say interoperability. And for me, there's sort of 3 main categories. One is interoperability of the technical tools. Software can talk to each other, right? Which is helpful in the banking sector and in other places. There's interoperability of data, which is some of the stuff that you talked about. And from my perspective, sitting in the human rights world, interoperability of data is the biggest issue we have in justice and accountability, because people are collecting data in different formats. And so we can't share it with each other. And that is a huge, huge problem. And then there's interoperability between sectors, right? I mean, if we look at the data that's being collected and used to operationalize humanitarian work, that's information that's also arguably, maybe controversially in this room, it's evidence, it's human rights evidence, right? And so, there's some of the need then is about recognizing the different uses for the data that's being collected in different sectors, who's the same data, just at a different part of the timeline, emergency or years later for accountability. So those are the sort of three buckets that I think of interoperability. But to look at the first one of like tech tools talking to each other, software talking to each other, that's what I want to focus on for a minute. Because in the human rights world, as it is, I'm sure, in the humanitarian sector, there is a lot of competition. There's a lot of competition for money. There's a lot of competition for attention. And the buzzword that I am so sick of is innovation, right? Like everything needs to be innovative. Everything needs to be shiny and new. And if you can be that shiny new innovator, you're going to get a bunch of money. But the problem with that is the shiny new tool is here, but for it to work, you need to rely on a whole bunch of technological tools that were already created. But they were created in spaces that were competitive, so no one's sharing them, right? So if a shiny new ML tool or AI tool is going to work, it needs a database. And often each project is going to develop a database. But like, hey, we develop a whole database software. It's called UWASI. So for us, interoperability is our strategy for both survival and for justice at this point. So every time that we work with a community who says, we want this feature, we kind of stop and say, well, actually, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Not what's the tech feature you think is going to solve it. And then we look at the field and say, like, does anybody else develop this already? Like, does this exist? Because if it does, let's just integrate it with our software. And we're going to get into the open source space. But so, because I agree, like, donors aren't necessarily going to be like, here's a bunch of money to like be able to integrate with a bunch of other tools. So we've baked it into our strategy. So partnership and interoperability, and making sure that our tool, which is called UWASI, and I'd be happy to share more information later, is coded to be friendly, basically, and that's really, really important. So it saves a lot of money, and it saves a lot of time, and that time and money can be put towards really understanding the problems that our partners are using, our partners are having. Just to give two quick examples. One is like OSINT, like open source investigations. Often information collected in OSINT investigations is actually in closed databases, right? Which makes sense, it's being preserved as evidence. But that information is such an important contextual piece to a lot of the private human rights research that's being carried out. So we're looking at ways that we can integrate or have interoperability with closed OSINT databases to pull that information directly into human rights research databases to help establish context and patterns, which would be really useful for advocacy. And then another really quick example of this, and this does come directly from needs from many of our partners, is around federated databases. We work in the most southern province, or state, pardon me, of Mexico, called Chiapas. And in Chiapas, it's a state that is rife with, there's crime, there is the cartels, there's different militaries, different police organizations. And the harms that civil society are facing are scattered across the state. And you see a lot of small organizations who are facing risk, facing attacks, whatever it is. And we've been working with them to build a federated system where they can keep track of everything that's happening to them, not necessarily about the research they're doing, but just about the harms that they're experiencing. And then that can be automatically published to a larger database. So everybody in the state can see the movements of cartels, can see the movement of threats. And that's one of those pieces where, do we need to do it all ourselves, or should we be integrating with other open source tools that can provide certain features? That's all I'll say. I could actually talk about interoperability for a long time.
Yeah.
I'll pause.
Can I ask Danna a question? Because I think there might be great if you've got a solution for this. I think one of the, well, you mentioned competition to start with, and I think within interoperability in the humanitarian space, I think this is the biggest barrier to interoperability. There is no database in the humanitarian system that you could not put 3 coders in a room and they could not make interoperable, honestly, in probably 20 minutes, but, give them a few days to make sure it's all, neat. Like the technology side is very, very simple. And honestly, with ChatGPT, maybe even I could do a bad job at it as well. But the reason it hasn't is because of competition as well. So you've got no organization wants to be, or the data is power, so no organization wants to share their data, because as soon as they do, then they lose control, over it. Just to pick on, WFP, they're the biggest, so they're the easiest, punching bag. If they're sharing their data with UNHCR, and UNHCR is, running the interoperable system, whatever, then they become subservient to UNHCR. So they sort of lose control to UNHCR. And so specifically within cash, this becomes even worse because, UNHCR has their mandate. Refugees, displaced people is what they do. WFP, food, great. But both of them do cash, and they both do a lot of cash as well. So if they're fighting over these mandates and the data, and they're both doing cash, then they're sort of losing their identities as well. And, the donors might, and any reasonable person might say, well, we don't need 2 organizations doing cash in Sudan. We might just have one national organization doing cash in Sudan. So how, in the human rights space, have you overcome that competition element to allow data sharing?
Or have you overcome it?
Or have we? This is being recorded, right? So I don't think that we've fully overcome it, and particularly now with the vacuum of funds going to all civil society, competition is greater. But maybe just to throw out something a little bit controversial. I mean, I think that we all think about technology and data in the mindset of the big tech giants that sort of rule our world, which is private and proprietary. And we kind of think that is the system on which we need to work. But data is about human beings, right? It's actually information about us. And so there's also a perspective around like the democratization of data. And it becomes a little different when you're talking about the tools that you are building. And I can't talk speak to the competition in the humanitarian sector. But again, for us at HURIDOCS, we've actively, walk away from projects that we could get funding for, but we don't want to recreate the wheel that somebody else has done. So I think that there's it has to be an organizational sort of commitment to democratization of information and data. That's really key. Yeah, I think that's what I say. It's a different strategy. I mean, the earlier panel was talking about the need to evolve, right? That the NGO model, the way it exists right now, is being deeply, deeply challenged. And as an NGO, at least in my organization, we need to ask what that means for us. And for us, that means we need to recognize that data belongs to the people who it's about, and that we should be making all of the services around data in service to them. And so it's about a bit of just a reimagining, I guess, of these structures that, at least in the human rights world, like human rights NGOs, it's been maybe 50 years? That's not always how activism has worked. So yeah, it's about a reimagining of those roots, if I could say that.
I just wanted, I think that I would follow this just to mention, having worked on both sides as well, and KoBo is now used by more than 30,000 organizations, 35,000, both in the humanitarian, human rights, environmental, a range of organizations. The same problem exists. In human rights side, when the invasion of Ukraine, or the large-scale invasion of Ukraine, it wasn't the first one, but the most recent one happened, you did see many, many human rights organizations emerge, many initiatives to document the violence, many of them uncoordinated, many of them repeating what they were each other doing. There's actually value in that because you're able to then compare, contrast what is captured by one, what is captured by the other, and it gives you insight into what is not captured by any. So there's value at times in those overlaps. And then ultimately many organizations came together and tried to federate so that what the work is done or how the work is done is better coordinated. So I think it happens in the humanitarian sector as well. I won't undermine and be naive around the competition, and especially when it comes to cash transfer. It was really interesting to hear this morning around the supply chain, and fundamentally they behave like corporation, and there is competition, and so the question is how would it unfold? But at the same time, there's also reality around, and this being still new. Humanitarian organizations have become data organizations. Human rights organizations have always been anecdotal or qualitative, but they are becoming quantitative, large data scale organizations, and they're not really equipped to do that, and they don't always have the reflection, the timeline, the processes, the policies in place to do that. One example I give all the time, I question, look at the organizations you are working with or know with, what is the data retention policy? That is one gap that I very often, nobody has planned. How long are we going to keep this data? How do we dispose it? At what point does it become, physically deleted from the record? We lack that, and that's a pretty simple, basic thing to have. And so there's still a lot that this sector is learning on what to do and how to deal with data, including in interoperability. And part of the challenge is move fast. Part of the challenge is there are more pressing questions, like in cash transfer. I do believe that the role of technology in pushing the risk to recipients is a very, very important issue, one that was recognized late. Of course, it's great for organization. You don't have to deal with the logistics of stress. It's trucks moving around. You don't have to deal with attacks on your distribution points. The people you serve have to deal with that. They are the ones who have to deal with potential abuse at the point of reception of your cash and everything. And so, those implications, luckily, because of the work of CaLP and others, are recognized, but they were very often recognized late. A lot of those questions follow at times with a lot of delay the actual adoption of technology. And I know it's a common thing to say, but we use the technology without quite understanding the implication. And by the time we're understanding the application, we still don't have yet the right processes and policies in place. And by the time we put those processes and policies in place, the technology has changed. And so there's really kind of this constant catch-up that is really difficult to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah, Danna, please.
Just super quickly, I mean, as you were talking, the thing that was really, both of you, the thing that was really coming to my mind is also that a huge challenge towards interoperability is the space to have conversations like this, right? And to learn from each other and to, I think the other problem is that we're all so busy in our line of sight of what needs to sort of get done that we don't rise our head above the parapets and kind of ask these questions and learn from each other, because there's so many pitfalls that so many people have been through. And if we could start from that learning, there would be some real goals there. So I just wanted to also sort of make the case for more sessions bringing these kinds of conversations together and face-to-face. Because, for example, KoBo Toolbox and Uwazi, our software, could work together a lot more than they do. And in our conversations today, I'm really motivated to find ways to integrate. So I think that's another piece, is that interoperability as a viewpoint of a community building perspective is also really important.
So maybe to wrap up the interoperability part of the discussion, so maybe to move forward, let's maybe take for granted that the data that you have, you can share. Like if you decide that you want to share it, and you find a use case where it's actually beneficial. So let's not assume data cannot be shared, but data can easily go from one organization to another and solve cases. Maybe that's something to take away from it. But then we're talking about competition, and we've been also mentioning the word open source, and then we have proprietary systems. So maybe some of you has a perspective how common are proprietary systems. Proprietary systems meaning anything but open. So it's closed systems that are only managed by the very organization that is running them. And then open source is software that is openly documented on open platforms where people can join in, possibly to develop the software further. So maybe give some perspective on that. Is there, how common is it? And what are the obstacles to the challenges to bring about, like, or to bring in more open source? And why is that? Like, why is it helpful? Anybody that I would like to.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in with KoBo Toolbox being kind of a, strong open source proposition. And as I've mentioned earlier, when we created it, there was no question for us. There was never, even, it's going to be open source. We actually created it for our own use. So we needed it in the field, and then people see it and start out, can we use it? And so we said, well, here it is, use it if you like it. But then it became more professional with organization approaching us, hey, how can we improve and continue building it? For us, the key question was maybe less about open source or closed source, or it was about access. It was, how can we make sure that that tool is accessible? And right now, I would say, there are some open source. There's a lot of closed source, tools that we use every day, from Microsoft softwares, emails, whatever we are using. It's common. I question less that distinction and more the question of access, because one of the key challenges is that when a large organization creates a tool for registration or case management or range of applications that we see, they then bring it, because I worked recently on help desk and phone systems. They of course, partner with local organizations that use those tools while the partnership exists. It's made available. Okay, you can use this, or not. You have to use our tool for your process. And then the day that organization leaves, they no longer have that tool available to them. We see it with data collection all the time, is that there are proprietary systems that can be very expensive, and organizations tell you, you have to use it. One, they don't always invest in training you on how to use it well. And more importantly, again, you're only allowed or able to use it for that collaboration, for that partnership. And the day that ends, that is gone. So for KoBo Toolbox, for us, the reason I think of it as kind of a poster child, or really kind of the perfect case in diffusion of innovation, is that our focus was on accessibility. The value is easy to demonstrate. You see that you're replacing paper form with something more efficient, and it functions. And it's easy to try because it's not complex to do. It's easy to sign up and get it done. And there's a reason we have 35,000 organizations doing it. So in some ways, I go back to your question. I see philosophically an importance of being open source for us, but the practical application is less about open versus closed source. It's about accessibility, financial accessibility, how easy it is to use, whether your documentation is available in multiple languages, whether you're able to provide support. We provide support to everyone. Like, we try to serve everyone the same, whether they are big organizations, small organization. When you are a for-profit, closed-ended software provider, you're thinking of market, you're thinking of profits, and that's, I think, fundamentally where the difference can be.
Well, I think in terms of competition, and there's some interesting examples in the data economy around Europe, where you actually have whole industry sectors that are sharing resources, that are like they're starting to use data spaces, like they're competitors, right? They're competitors, they have their own supply chains, but they're starting to share resources because they see the benefit of integrating their information systems to have efficient. Now I'm drinking. It's the first time I said it. No, second time, I guess. Like processes. So I guess it's, yeah, there's like the whole discussion around open source is changing. It's becoming a very significant part of the public discussion in Europe, at least. Digital sovereignty, open source, etc. So we're all trying to move into the open to have a level of transparency and compete fairly, I suppose. So that's a maybe as a part of the thing that we should consider in discussion.
Yeah, if I mean on that, and again, I don't want to to sound more negative or misrepresent, the reality is the reason KoBo is the way it is today is because a number of organizations decided they didn't want to compete and create their own data collection tool, and decided to invest in a global public good. And by the way, I would in fact go back to the history of KoBo and the current version of the platform, which is that 10 years ago, we approached USAID. USAID is this agency that used to exist. We approached USAID, OCHA approached USAID, IRC approached USAID, all of us to create and improve on our data collection tool, and USAID said, no, you guys get together, sit in a room, and come back to us with one proposal. The reality is KoBo was the one that was already existing, and so we were able to advance that, but donors have an important role to play in that function. Now, I go back to what I said earlier, that there is value in not having just one tool. You know, there is value in making sure that there are different initiatives, but there's also value in trying to reduce overlaps and repeating the same thing over and over. Like, so I think there's a balance there in trying to make sure that there is innovation and that you support new ideas and new ways of doing things. And that may include creating a new or reflecting on a new data collection system. And at the same time, there is value in consolidating and approaching those resources as a global public good. And I think global public good can actually be closed sourced. I don't necessarily have, you know, a negative view on that, but is it accessible? Is it fairly accessible, or is the price? You know, if you're going to price out 90% of the humanitarian sector that are community-based local organizations that just can't afford it, that don't have a credit card to sign in to your system because that's the only payment you accept, well, that's the problem. And so that's where we need to make sure that that accessibility exists.
I know we were supposed to find things to disagree on to make the panel interesting, but I have to say a huge +1 to the accessibility part. Closed, not. Accessibility, couldn't agree more.
Okay. Rory, what about like the cash payments and open source, proprietary, like what's the relationship there, and what's your position on this?
Yeah, again, desperately trying to find something to disagree on here.
Okay.
But I think just echoing the views, that the distinction, I think, less between sort of open source and proprietary, because I think when I joined the sector, there was this sort of big optimism around open source technology, because I think to the, you know, sort of board level, they essentially saw it as free technology. They're like, wait, instead of paying license fees, we can just get this free technology, and some random person in their bedroom will be updating this code base for us, and, you know, great, and we're not going to be locked in. And I think then they realized, you know, okay, if you have open source, then you might need to, you know, have a hosting for your, you know, hosting yourself, or, you know, you need quite a lot of technological capacity internally to, you know, to use open source technology, you know, fully self-host. And I think you'd probably be amazed at what size organization you have to get to before they've got that capacity to really engage fully and contribute to open source technology. I mean, if we're looking at NGOs, most NGOs below sort of $200-300 million a year revenue won't have somebody on staff who can even, you know, open GitHub or, and let alone, you know, contribute to an open source technology. And if they do, they're probably doing it in their own time. They're probably not being thanked for doing it as well. I think Reshma this morning used the phrase persistence as well. They're probably doing it against the, you know, wishes of their, you know, whoever they're reporting to, and, you know, who'd rather they were focusing on, you know, donor compliance or, you know, or whatever their main, you know, job is as well. But I think looking at the distinctions a bit sort of smarter, looking at the licenses, perhaps looking at open standards as well. So, you know, there's those sort of terrible cases where, you know, I think the South African government hired a proprietary, or hired somebody to build a proprietary ID system for them, and then when they came to renew the license, decided to go with a different provider, and the company was like, well, it's our data, and we're not going to give you the data. So that, you know, but if they'd had open standards and ways to access the data, then they, you know, they could have still had their proprietary system, which might have been the right approach, but then still had access to their own data as well. And I think within the cash space, a lot of the underlying financial technology that the companies use, whether they're banks, mobile money providers, fintechs, a lot of that technology is open source. I mean, we're sort of blind to using it or to their use because, we're not fintech experts as well. But there is a huge amount of collaboration. And I think the payment space is fascinating for this, is that you see all these companies as competitors, whether it's Visa or Revolut or Setbank or something. But actually, because of the nature of payment systems, these companies do compete, but they all have to work together to make sure that, if I want to use my card here, that, my funds in the UK can, travel via the, correspondent bank or whoever it is as well. So they're really used to working together. So it makes sense for them to come together to use this open source technology as well. And I think there's a really interesting example called Moja Loop that's been running for quite a while now. That's a payment aggregation platform that is seeing some uptake in or some explorations in humanitarian use cases. Because I think it's easy to sit here and think, oh shit, I'm overwhelmed. It's all terrible. There's no money. We're all just competing. What do I sort of take away from this? And I think one theme that you could take away from this, so next time you're trying to solve a problem, think about the word choice. So providing recipients with a choice over the modality as to how they receive support, and also the delivery mechanism as well. So, if they have chosen to receive cash, how would they want to receive that cash as well? And, we've seen in Ukraine examples, particularly, a older woman in a rural environment has a different delivery mechanism preference to a younger person in an urban setting as well. But 95%, I've made that up, but prove me wrong, I think cash programs in each country will have one delivery mechanism. And they will say, for the next 3 years, this is how we're going to deliver cash. And there are so many issues with that. It hampers financial inclusion, creates these sort of parallel financial delivery mechanisms. And it also acts as like kind of a kingmaker as well, because they're the ones getting all the transfer fees from a lot of the implementers as well. But if you could use something like a Moja Loop, which is fully free and open source, to act as an aggregator, linking up all those delivery mechanisms in country, you could give that recipient a choice when you register, say, well, okay, what do you want to receive? And they might say food, they might say shelter, they might say GBV support. They'll probably say cash to a certain extent as well. I mean, just as an aside, I was looking at, it was mentioned this morning, I looked at 10 multi-sector needs assessments the other day, and 2 of them asked recipients what support they'd like to receive. So I don't know if you've ever seen one of these forms, but these are like 2-hour interviews with households that go into their most personal demographic. How many people in the household? What health concerns do you have? What jobs do you do? How much rent do you pay? The most insanely personal thing. And 2 of the 10 then ended asking the person what support would they actually like to receive as well, which in a people-centered, when we talk about it, is again, it's crazy. But then, so if you could at the end of it ask them, okay, how would you like to receive support? What support would you like to receive? And then how you'd like to receive it, then you actually flip something which is, I think, missing from our sector, is you make them the customers of the program as well. So at the moment, within a humanitarian intervention, who is the customer of the donor funds, essentially? It's Save the Children or WFP or whoever you're working for, because they're the ones largely accountable. But if you give people choice as to what they receive and how they receive it, then and allow them to change that choice, they become the customers of the program. They become the most important people as well.
Would you say, Rory, is that a problem to solve? Like, I mean, that's obviously, like, we talked about, like, focus on problems first, like not talk about abstract concepts, but let's talk about problems. Like, would you say that is one to look at and see, I don't know, whatever solution there is that could solve it?
I think it's I think, but for me, choice is the solution. I think the problem, I mean, if you look at, there's a fantastic organization called Ground Truth Solutions, and they spend a lot of time doing really in-depth research with recipient and community groups, saying, asking them about the humanitarian relief they received. And they say predominantly two things, three things. We want cash, we want more cash, or often they phrase it as, we want my neighbor to have more cash as well, which I think is a nice way of putting it. And they also want more information about the interventions they're enrolled on. So I think focusing on those problems and which are recipient desires, and I think choice is one of the solutions which I think is shows the most promise, and interoperability to bring it back to the start is one of the ways in which you can provide that choice.
If I can follow on that, we also do a lot of perception survey that were mentioned earlier, and Ground Truth Solution is doing similar work. But let me just give you an example. It's going to be a bit of a detour, but I have a point to make. In Eastern DRC, we did surveys, 25, 30 years of humanitarian response. We did survey on perception of humanitarian actors. About 10% of the people are positive about whether humanitarians respect local customs and tradition. About the same percentage of people feel that humanitarians address their needs. About the same percentage of people are positive about trust in humanitarian actors overall. We have a reputation problem, we have an engagement problem, we have an efficiency problem. There are reasons why all this happens, and just to go back to the question of trust, is that there are many sources of trust, but one aspect of trust is very transactional. I trust you because you behave in the way that I expect, because you're providing what I'm supposed to receive, and so on. And that's the point, is that to the extent that technology can help strengthen that part, that transaction, that is better capturing the needs and better providing modalities that address needs, I think that's important. So when it comes back to solving one problem, I think that's fundamentally one that needs solving. We heard about trust this morning. I bring it back. There was no shot associated to that. But fundamentally, it is that transformation. It is about making sure that we follow the principles of humanity, of addressing needs wherever they are, but also in whichever way the community wants them to be addressed. And it seems obvious, but it is a big challenge, and I'll end with that in a second, but that is part of the fear with both the situation we're in now when it comes to funding, but also the role of technology, is that it is very easy to go the other direction. The direction where everything is about our national interest, where every decision-making is taken away, where technology is used not to empower locally, but really to re-centralize things. Because I can sit today in New York and know more about what's happening in wherever in Jamaica, to take a recent, or in the Philippines, to take two of the recent natural disasters. I have all the information, which means I have a sense that I know what needs to be done. And also the technology that I use is the technology that my organization has approved, that has been vetted, that is secured. So we re-centralize everything. And so part of the concern is that one, is that we are really at a kind of a tension between norms of security, centralization, kind of refocusing in that sense versus the localization agenda. And I don't know which one will, frankly, win.
So maybe to paraphrase Michelle Obama, when they go closed, we go open, maybe to make it all in the open. Like the more centralized some sector becomes, like, let's make it more open, maybe to take this away from. We've got some very interesting questions from the audience as well. And Danna, I want to ask you the first one, and then you other two can obviously also comment on that. Do you see any potential for malicious actors capitalizing on democratized violence, abuse data to gain, or to to help their agenda, I suppose? Like, is there a risk? Like, I mean, you're capturing data in the field, and like, what are the risks? And obviously, I guess that's a question about expertise and skill as well, which is related to another question, like how many people in the humanitarian sector can actually talk about digitization and who are capable of having this conversation?
Super, super, super question. Not sure who put it out, but I think
Ganchi.
Excellent question. And yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue, right? And you know, we partner at HURIDOCS, we partner with about 300 civil society organizations around the world on over 400 projects. And some of these projects are working in some pretty sensitive areas, and that data is, we have to be really careful. And I think one of the things that, you know, wanted to keep in mind, like, so we're also an open source data, that open source doesn't mean open, and the software with which we are keeping the data in is open source, so people can audit it and they can look at it. But we actually have closed servers where we're keeping the data, and linking it to the open source versus proprietary question. Actually, for many civil society organizations around the world, it's a lot more scary and dangerous to have your data held by big tech, right? If your data is going through Amazon Web Services, you don't really know what government is going to get a backdoor to that data, right? So I think for us, we actually lean into being an open source tool that can work outside of dominant infrastructure as a security tool. And that's a very important piece for us. And we actually right now are also looking at infrastructure like as basically like a self-determination tool. Like, we need infrastructure, we need tech infrastructure outside of tech giants in order to have alternate safe spaces. The other thing, yeah, so I think nefarious actors can use data in so many different ways. Also, so can we. And I think, one of the things I mentioned earlier was about access versus accessibility. And if you're able to learn more from the data you have, you're basically going to have, I guess I just go back to like fighting apples with apples. We know that, nefarious actors are using data, and we need to use data too. And so it's always a balance, and we have to make decisions on a project by project basis as to whether the security situation is such that we can share data or not.
I meant more in terms of gaining notoriety. So if there is data out there, I wrote at the end, a la ISIS in Syria when the circulation of lots of beheading videos. And I don't know if this could be, or have you seen, for example, because you mentioned Chiapas?
And if, sorry, I'm going to repeat, to gain notoriety in terms of almost creating fear using data or data on abuse as a tool for their project. It may be too abstract, but just was kind of curious because cartels can use example setting as a method for creating fear, right? And I wonder if this could be
Did you want to
used.
Sure, I'd like to reflect on what you were saying, but then maybe on that. I think it's maybe less about data and more about the use of social media and public imaging and communication, and we know that's an issue. And to bring it back to the conversation, we also know that organizations are not well equipped to deal with that, to deal with misinformation, because one thing that the video is real, it's another thing that we see increasingly. In fact, just in the last day or two, there are satellite imagery that are being used to pretend to document killing in Sudan. Not that the killing didn't happen, but the image themselves are pretending, oh, that's blood on the ground. I say, that's not blood on the ground, that's actually plants and whatever, and these are not dead bodies, those are animals. The point is that the misinformation, those are definitely factors, whether it's false, whether it's real, but using social media, it's the new reality in which humanitarian actors need to operate. And traditionally, we don't, right? Traditionally, for example, going back to my experience in the field, as a humanitarian, you don't engage with the media. You don't talk, like you're really afraid, and the only thing you do with the media is you ask them to cover your thing, to give you a positive image, but you don't answer, you don't talk to misinformation. That's really changing quickly. Organizations do it and do it better, but it is again changing fast, and our ability to adapt to that new reality is not as good as it should be. And then to go back to the broad question of technology and the risk with data and so on, let me just first, we need to be humble, right? Every big corporation has had a breach at some point. We are not set up to resist any kind of serious state-sponsored targeted attack. They will do it. They will manage to get to the information one way or the other. Now, that doesn't mean we don't need to be ready to minimize risk. And then again, that's a part where we need to do better at understanding what are the actual risks, where do they exist, what kind of data is more risky than others, and navigating those questions is still something in process. The point that I want to make here is that we need to work on all that, but we need to work on the right to remedy. We need to work on the consequences. And it's not a criticism of that organization, but when IFRC had a data breach on their reunification database, they had the means, they had the ability to go back to the family and say, look, the data was breached, here is what we are going to do, here's what we anticipate are the consequences. That is not the case for most humanitarian actors. Most of us don't have the ability to even detect whether we've had a breach, let alone do anything about that. And so advancing right to remedy and true serious mechanism to respond to this is really important. And that cash transfer, we've seen some of those questions. And just to add, second mention of AI, but I think the right to human review, right to be forgotten, right to alternative mechanisms, especially when we talk about autonomous decision, are become really, really important. It goes back to this morning, principled humanitarian action. There are models of humanitarian actions that are completely different, that are state-sponsored. If we look at China, it is about states-to-state collaboration. Nobody cares about rights, about anything like that, and maybe that's one model. Is that the model we want? I believe in the model that is more normative and where rights are important, that the protection of human rights is important. And I believe that those rights are emerging, rights to human review, rights to remedy, are something that as humanitarian we need to be better at.
I'd also like to just jump in on the clarification on the question with 2 points. So one of the points is that, yes, often videos like that will fuel fear. And a huge part of that is then collecting the data that shows the truth, right? And to counter that fear. And that is so much of what the project in Chiapas is looking at, right? Because there's so much fear about like the movement of the gangs and the movement of the federales. But and it's often spread through WhatsApp groups and stuff like that, which is sometimes fine, but it's a game of telephone, right? And so these organizations, about 20 small organizations, are sharing real-time information about the threats so they know what's actually happening. And I think that that's like putting that power of information back when people are going to be spreading fear. Another problem that we face, and this might not be so much for this space, but I did want to mention it, is that deep fakes, AI, is also being used against civil society, but as a way to say, your information's fake, right? So evidence collected by human rights defenders around the world is being quickly discredited by those who don't want it by saying it's fake. And so we have a this is one of those things, a need. The need is to make sure that the data that we've collected and sitting in our databases has a chain of custody that can prove that it's valid and the veracity of it. And so, going to interoperability, we're looking at other orgs that are creating verification tools, but then we would just code it into our backend to be solid so that they can push back against the kind of attacks that are coming from that situation.
Okay. We're slowly coming to our panel's end, so I'm gonna try to have to wrap it up. It's been very interesting, but maybe a pointed question where you all can take a statement on. So what are your recommendations or maybe even expectations to donors? It's a question from the audience as well. Expectation to donors and how to promote or how to spread the word about digital tools. Like, is there something that you think they need to do? Or what are actions, like from your perspective, maybe Patrick and Danna, like how to promote or are you even in the position where your tools need to be promoted, or have they spread so far already that they don't need any further promotion? No. Promotion. So like, how do you promote open source technology in humanitarian aid, and what roles donors, or what expectations towards donors do you have?
Do you want to go first?
I didn't, but I will.
I will.
Please go ahead.
I'll give you some time to think. Okay, so one of the things with donors that that I'm kind of constantly going on about is actually a lesson that I feel that we learned, or at least a lesson that we unearthed about 10, 15 years ago around digital security. So there was this like wave of digital security, and everybody wanted digital security training, and there was trainings, and then there was train the trainers, and we were always kind of going to donors and being like, why isn't a digital security like line in every single grant you make? Like, why is it that now we have to create NGOs to do digital security training and then compete with NGOs, right? And that really surfaced, and I feel like we're kind of, it's a little deja vu right now in terms of these tools, because it's like, why should I be applying to a donor to build a tool to serve the people that they're already giving grants to? So my call to donors is really to look at it, their grant giving holistically and based on the needs that people have. So that if they are granting a project that's going to involve a lot of, either use of digital tools or collection of data, to make sure that they have the resources to use the right tools. So for us, for example, we go for grants, but we also co-fundraise when we meet a project who wants to use our tools that they don't have the money for it. So I think for me, that's a big one, is particularly now with the huge lack of money that has recently, pulling all this money from the system, donors need to get much more efficient in how that money is spent. And for me, that's a key part of it. And then also, I know again earlier you mentioned that donors aren't into paying for interoperability, but to look at that, right? And to look at it and to grant projects that are looking at being more interoperable and are acting in a more community phase will help them save money, and it will help the rest of us. And just to say, my tool, Uwazi and HURIDOCS, needs all the promotion we can get, and I'll be happy to sign anyone up for a demo. But yeah, that would be my answer.
Maybe just so we use the term interoperable, but maybe we can transcribe interoperable as collaborative, and make it reflect on all different layers of providing humanitarian aid, whether it's on the technical level, as you said, software, or data level, etc. So maybe that's something to take away as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But what about you, Patrick and Rory?
I really feel the pain of donors sitting with money and not knowing what to do with it. It's a challenging question, but I would say go back maybe to two things. One is global public good, and I think having organization articulate how, and here I'm really talking of the technology part, right? But how that investment will serve as a global public good. And I go, just to give an example, when the language around community engagement emerged, it seems so obvious, right? But donors had to write it down well. You have to spell out how you have engaged. How does this reflect a community-driven demand and so on? But that was not enough. And so again, USAID started implementing, well, not only do we want to make sure you have community feedback mechanism and that you have that kind of engagement, but you need to spell out how you're going to use that information. How is that information going to change what you do? Well, I think we need to get towards that. We need to have that kind of level of articulation, not just we're developing tools, yes, it will be accepted. Spell it out. Explain us exactly how will it serve as a global good? How does it advance broader systems of response that are sustainable, that are durable at the local level, and start enforcing some of those requirements on tools. I don't say that they should require tools to be open source, but they should require maybe tools to be accessible or have some plans for durability. If you're going to impose to a local partner to use one tool, well, that partner should retain some ways of using that tool in the future.
Rory, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with that. I think the donors get a really bad rap, I think, sometimes in not funding this stuff. And you know, I was in a meeting with UNGA a couple of weeks ago, and a big European donor was there. I mean, she sort of stood up and she was saying, you know, we want to take risks. We want to fund innovative things, you know, take risks sensibly, but like she said, you know, we want to be at the cutting edge or the bleeding edge of, you know, the use of technology as well. So they were sort of crying out for new technologies, you know, new requests essentially to come through. And then a week later, I was in a different meeting with where the German government mentioned they were exploring the use of stable coins for moving money into one of their, you know, programmatic countries. And then after that, I had 2 different European donors reach out to me, like within 3 minutes after the meeting, be like, how do we do this? Should we be doing this as well? They're sort of terrified of being left behind, but they also have the appetite as well. Okay. So I think encourage you to sort of put it into the proposals, but do it in the smart way. You know, we've been learning about here, sort of perhaps making it open source, being collaborative, making sure you're not reinventing the wheel as well. Because I think in a lot of cases, the barriers are more in, you know, your bureaucratic structures within your larger organizations rather than the donors. I think the donors, if we had them all here today, would be saying they're frustrated with their inability to fund it because people just put in, you know, the same old requests without actually, you know, really pushing the envelope as well, whereas it's the organizations themselves who are not really trying to be forward-thinking and risk-taking as well, partly because, you know, I think grant-driven processes are a terrible way to take risks, but that's a whole nother, I think, avenue we could explore as well.
Okay.
With 3 minutes left, we're engaging in the controversy. I really think that's the wrong framing. I think that we want innovation. We want to know, be at the cutting edge. The reality is, digital data collection is not rocket science. We have 35,000 organizations users. We estimate that there's at least 100,000 of them out there that are using pens and papers to collect data. Because they don't know. That's not rocket science. That's not the bleeding edge. The reality, to go back to the human rights field, because I've worked in that space, is that there are places, there are entire countries where they don't know who is in prison. How long should they be in prison? Because none of that is digitized, because none of that is tracked down, because there is vested interest in keeping it on paper, because you can fudge the numbers and whatever, keep people, you know, whatever way they do. So that's not the leading edge. I think the problem is not to want innovation for innovation's sake. It's the digital inclusion. It's great, but it has to be back to the needs, back to the demand, and very often it is not going to be the shiny thing. It is going to be the project that digitizes intake forms for a reception center for abducted children or former combatants. That is not rocket science, but that is a global good, and that is something that needs assistance.
Yeah, so I would jump in and second that, and you know, I think it's also, when we think about innovation, people often think about the newest, biggest thing and like, oh, that's going to totally be radical. But actually, innovation can bringing it back to basics, like, you know, moving away necessarily from you know, paper and pen and looking at different ways of doing analytics. And there's an argument that real, true, sustainable innovation will happen when we have a foundational base that's strong. And I think that's the piece that we really need to start focusing on. And I'm often explaining, you know, we have wonderful donors, but I'm often explaining to donors why it's actually still really important to focus on documentation. Like, you know, they're like, can you create an AI chatbot from that data? I'm like, yeah, maybe at some point, but let's actually get a database with all the information and get enough data points to train something. And so I think often, like, it's hard to explain that innovation is about the grounding, not necessarily the reach in that space. But it does really answer the needs of so many people. And I also don't want us to be in a situation of you know, furthering the digital divide. And, you know, people who are at the ability to use innovative tools get funding, and others who aren't are kind of left behind, because right now we need to find ways to raise up voices in the conflicts and the situations that we're in now.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to wrap it up here. So that was a very intriguing discussion, at least from my perspective. I hope for you too. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting you all here in Tallinn, and I'll definitely have a closer look at at your tools. They look interesting. I've already looked at them, and there's more to discover out there in that field. So, yeah, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.